up in the same city. Our families knew each other. In the Jewish community, we belonged to the same synagogue. And the Hebrew school, the Hebrew school that I went to, his mother was my Hebrew school teacher. His father was the principal of the school. His father was involved in the Hebrew college in Philadelphia. So that was from age 5. We never met, we just always knew each other. But it was during the sort of adolescent years that we became, where there got to be a relationship.
In 1993, there was a list of the top 10 authorities cited in U.S. academic journals of the arts and humanities in the previous 7 years. So this is a list from number 1 to number 10. Number 1, Karl Marx, Lenin, William Shakespeare, Aristotle, the Bible, Plato, Freud, Noam Chomsky, Hegel, Cicero.
If I'm a persona that attracts people, the world's in real trouble. I mean, I'm not a. If I had the capacity to be a good speaker, which I don't, I wouldn't use it. I mean, I'm a boring speaker, and I like it that way. And if people want to come and hear me, that's fine. I don't do a song and dance, and I don't have fancy rhetoric. I doubt very much that anybody is attracted by whatever the persona is. People are interested in the issues. And they're interested in the issues because they're important. But the so-called war on terror, there are people who want it to be a war against Muslims. I mean, I'm sure that's Osama bin Laden's fondest dream. If he could turn it into a war against Muslims, he'd have won. Then you get the Muslim world fighting the West, and it'll be a battle to the end of days. And I'm sure ultra-right Christian fundamentalists want the same thing. It's one of the reasons they support the extremist right in Israel. So yeah, there are people who would like that to turn out, but I'm sure that the guys planning it in Washington don't. I mean, that'd be the craziest thing for them to even think about. That's why they tossed North Korea into the axis of evil. Well, what's North Korea got to do with Iran and Iraq? I mean, I got more to do with them. But North Korea is not Muslim, so if you throw that in, it sort of makes it look as it's not a war. And it isn't, I mean, it's pretty obvious. I mean, just say the last assassination in Yemen, which everybody thinks was wonderful. Suppose this was assassination of a person who was suspected of involvement in terrorist acts and 5 other guys who happened to be around. Okay? And that's considered, peaches and cream. Suppose that Cuba assassinated Orlando Bosch, say. I mean, maybe the leading international terrorist in the world. You don't have to suspect him. He's got a long record of terrorist activities, including involvement in blowing up a Cubana airliner, killing 73 people, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And he's happily living in Florida, along with a whole pile of other international terrorists. So suppose Cuba assassinated him, with a missile attack. What do you think would happen? It would have drastic retaliation, which could go all the way. Nobody knows what's going to happen once you start a war. Just take a look at history. Anybody who tried to predict was usually wildly wrong. It's just too many things can happen. But we know what is intended. So, for example, people right near the center of power, like Richard Pearl and Rumsfeld and the rest of them, they've described their long-term intentions. Actually, Pearl and others were writing position papers 6 years ago for Benjamin Netanyahu. That's the ultra-right in Israel, to the right of Sharon. And these papers, they're not detailed, but they describe a vision for the Middle East, which is basically like the Ottoman Empire, centers of power in Jerusalem and Ankara, of course, as part of the U.S. global system, and the rest of the region kind of given local regional autonomy. I mean, one idea they talk about is extending the Jordanian Hashemite kingdom to parts of Iraq and parts of Saudi Arabia. In this framework, we'd offer an opportunity for driving out the Palestinians and solving that problem, and then reorganizing the whole region. I mean, there's crazy ideas. These ideas actually are scaring the hawks, the hardline hawks, who are warning, not to pay attention to the what they call the sillier armchair strategists, who unfortunately happen to be right near the center of power. So they got long-term objectives, in fact, reaching all the way to China. But what'll happen? I mean, nobody can guess. I mean, we know what the CIA predicts. What they predict is a large increase in terrorism. They say right now, in fact, and other world intelligence agencies say exactly the same thing, and it's kind of obvious. You don't need the CIA to tell you. I mean, if you attack Iraq, first of all, you're going to spawn a new generation of people who want revenge. It's almost predictable, and it's very likely. I mean, if you're Saddam Hussein, there's only one deterrent, and that's terror attacks. So, very likely. It wouldn't be surprising if there's somebody in New York has already assembled the parts of a nuclear bomb, sneaking it across the Canadian border, which is pretty porous, and it's just waiting for the signal. I mean, that's the kind of thing intelligence agencies have been worrying about for years, way before September 11th, and are expecting now as the consequence of an attack. I mean, maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. They don't know. Intelligence agencies aren't that, don't know that much, but it's a plausible expectation. Notice that the threats to our interest at that time could also not be laid at Iraq's door. This is March 1990. At that time, Saddam Hussein was a favored friend and trading partner of the U.S. and the UK, Thatcher, Reagan, Bush, and the rest. In fact, all the people who are now running the show in Washington, they thought he was a fine guy. That was a position that he retained for another few months until August 1990, when he committed the first crime that really mattered, namely disobeying orders. At that point, he lost the status of moderate, which had been unaffected by such acts as gassing Kurds and torturing dissidents and using chemical weapons, and in fact everything else that he's now being correctly charged for that never mattered at all. And the U.S. and Britain continued to not only support him, but provide him with the means to develop weapons of mass destruction. That continued right up till the first disobedience. These are all, again, facts it wouldn't do to mention in these grim days right now, especially when Tony Blair and George Bush and everyone else is talking about how we can't let this monster survive after he committed all these crimes, which they then enumerate, all accurately, but always missing a few words, like with our help, because we didn't care, and therefore we continued to provide him with weapons of mass destruction after them. That's invariably missing, as you can see. But it was there, and there were also reasons. The reasons were very straightforward. So as the State Department explained in early 1990, the reason is that our duty to support U.S. exporters. That's when they were overriding cabinet objections and congressional objections in continuing support for their friend Saddam, who was fulfilling his function properly, and continuing to help him develop weapons of mass destruction. George Bush the first was authorizing support for him up to the day before the invasion of Kuwait. The British were a little slower on the draw, and they continued doing it a couple of days later before they managed to realign their priorities. But Saddam Hussein's crimes had absolutely nothing to do with it. All of his worst crimes were behind him at that point. In fact, it's interesting, the people who recognize this are conservatives. So, for example, in Foreign Affairs, which is, the most respectable establishment journal you can think of, a couple of right-wing military analysts, John and Robert Miller, I think their name, a couple of years ago, pointed out that the number of people killed by the sanctions in Iraq is greater than the total number of people killed by all weapons of mass destruction in all of history. You know? But notice we're doing it to them, so it's therefore not a crime or a problem. If they did it to us, of course, you know, something else. It's an ongoing war. It's had a devastating effect on the population. I mean, there's no reputable authority who doubts that the number of children killed by them is less than in the hundreds of thousands. I mean, you can argue about the numbers, but, and, well, you've seen the consequences. I mean, Iraq was on the verge of becoming a first world society. Now it's a very poor, devastated third world society. And if the war is, as you put it correctly, escalated sharply, it could push them off the edge.
He's in a class on his own as far as contemporary intellectuals are concerned. He has, on the one hand, this huge track record in linguistics as one of the most important linguists who've ever lived. In addition to that, he's had this lifelong commitment to political activism. Putting the two things together really does put him in a class on his own. He has a very important message to put out, one that's not often heard. He's extraordinarily well informed. I mean, he seems to, so far as one can tell, he's read everything and remembered what he's read as well, which is, it's just astonishing to talk to him.
It's funny how hard it is. It takes so much background. I mean, the amount of time that is spent acquiring the background is, I mean, it's a very specific kind of life in which that's what he does. He reads, 6 newspapers a day and 80 journals altogether, I think. And this is sort of half of his professional life, in a way. It's not really his professional life. I mean, and so it's his second career.
First of all, their pressure on the national media has an effect. I mean, look, even in totalitarian states, they respond to pressure, certainly in more democratic societies. So there are pressures on the media have an effect. Furthermore, the media are in many ways more open and free than they were 40 years ago because they reflect the general raising of the level of civilization. I mean, a lot of people in the media are people who came through the experiences of the 60s and 70s and 80s, and they're just different than they were 40 years ago. So you don't get the kind of, unquestioning loyalty. I mean, if an American president today tried to do what Kennedy did in 1962, there'd be an uproar in the media, not just in the public. And besides, there's now alternatives, like one of the earlier questioners mentioned, that the internet is a major alternative. New technology, which wasn't developed for that purpose, but it's there, is giving all sorts of options for alternative ways of communicating. For one thing, printing is just a lot cheaper than it ever was. It's desktop publishing is now very feasible. You don't have to have a big printing establishment, the electronic communications there are all kinds of ways, and organizations that develop, they develop their own intercommunication and interaction and media, and that's the way things happen. So there's plenty of opportunities.
I remember the criticisms that American media were making of the Russian invasion of Afghanistan at the time. And Chomsky turned around and said, it's all well and good for American journalists to criticize Russians in Afghanistan. The audience for them, who's going to hear that, isn't going to be able to do much to help the Afghans. And you can sound very pious about it, but the real test of protest is who your audience is. And are you addressing an audience that can do something to improve the situation? If you're addressing Americans about what Russians are doing in Afghanistan, that's kind of cowardly, is what he said. Really, American media should be addressing American public and American leaders about what they're doing around the world and supporting the Indonesians in East Timor or supporting death squads in El Salvador. That kind of stuff is courageous. But criticizing Russians, that's for the Russian media to do, and because they can actually have an impact on the Russian public and Russian politicians.
I mean, the period when the press was most free was about the mid-19th century. I mean, at that time, just keeping to say England and the United States, the two cases that have been studied, I imagine it's the same elsewhere. In the mid-19th century, there was a very lively, popular press, very widely read by working people, by everyone. That, much reached far beyond the commercial media at the time. It was very diverse. It represented, it reflected public interest and public concerns, and was very popular. In Britain, they tried to close it down by censorship of various kinds, but that didn't work. There were too many ways to avoid it. And it was finally understood that the way to eliminate it was by advertising, by reliance on advertising and by concentration of capital. So just through the effect of reliance on advertising, which was then just a kind of beginning, like around a century ago, and concentration of capital, they realized that over time they could marginalize the independent popular press, which couldn't get the advertising, of course, because advertisers don't like what they were saying, and didn't have the capital. And it took a long time. So in England, it was actually up until about 40 years ago, still the case 40 years ago, that the main newspaper in England, the Daily Herald, was a kind of labor-oriented, social democratic newspaper, very popular. Everybody had outsold all the others. The Mirror, which was the main tabloid, was the same, kind of leftist paper, popular paper. But they kind of succumbed to advertising pressure and capital control. The United States happened a bit earlier, but it was the same process. And advertising is, it's part of a much bigger industry. Advertising is part of the public relations industry, which is a huge industry. And it developed very consciously around the First World War in the two most democratic countries, England and the United States. And there's a good reason for it. They were coming to as the countries were becoming more free, that just through popular struggle, and people were winning the franchise, and you couldn't shut them up anymore by force, it was understood that you're going to have to control people by controlling opinion and attitudes, because we can't rely on force anymore. And control of opinion and attitudes means, there was actually a phrase for it. This was the time when what was called scientific management of work was becoming a big issue, Taylorite management, Ford and all that stuff. But it was also understood you want to not only control very closely the lives of people in their work time, but also you have to control them in their off-work time. And what you have to do is turn them into passive, obedient consumers who don't pay, don't try to get out of our hair, basically. Pay attention to what were called the superficial things of life, like fashionable consumption. You get them trapped into consumerism, isolated from one another, atomized, control their beliefs. That's where notions like manufacture of consent come from right after this First World War. And out of this came huge industries. And advertising is a large part of it, and it, of course, affects the media enormously. I mean, if any of you are, if you watch television, for example, take, say, television. When you turn on the television set, the corporation doesn't make any money, right? Like you don't pay them when you turn it on, unless it's cable. But they do. So why do they do it? Well, they do it because of the advertising. So the resources and the creativity and the effort and so on in the whole television industry goes into advertising. In fact, within the television industry, there are words called content and fill. Like a program has content and a program has fill. The content is the advertising. The fill is the car chase that's in there to keep you watching until the next ad comes along. And all the effort, of course, goes into the advertising. And the fill has two You know, first of all, it's keep your interest enough so you watch the advertising, but the advertising is there for a purpose. I mean, it's to turn people into creatures whose only concern in life is to max out their 5 credit cards and not to pay attention to what's going on in the world and let the rich, powerful guys do what they want without interference. So I'm on mainstream television all the time. In Ireland, England, you know, Italy, New Zealand. I mean, there's television. In fact, the public television studios in Boston, all the staff knows me very well. I'm there all the time for satellite broadcasts to even used to be Canada too, that's now declined. And occasionally in the United States. I mean, commercial television is much less constrained than public television. Public television is more liberal, and it's therefore much more ideological and imposes much narrower constraints. They don't allow deviance. That's pretty constant. Yeah, they don't want, I mean, it's not in their interest to have people talk about things like this. Sometimes they're pressured, and they'll allow a couple of minutes here and there. And it's kind of interesting the way it works. So the television's mostly out, except for commercial cable television. But radio is a little freer. The National Public Radio is considered the liberal, you know, the kind of outer limits of the left in the United States. Very small, but it's considered very dissident. And they're the ones with the sharpest restrictions by far. I mean, they won't allow a millimeter of deviation from the party line. But sometimes they are under pressure to do it. And it's interesting the way it works. So, for example, during the first Gulf War, I'm pretty well known around Boston, you know, and that happens to be the center, the ideological center for National Public Radio. It's their flagship station and all that sort of thing. And there's a lot of pressure there to let me be on now and then. So during the first Gulf War, they did approach me, and they told me I would be allowed to have 2.5 minutes. However, they insisted that I write out what I was going to say, send it to the central office so they could ensure that it's, you know, okay. And once they approved it, I had to read it. And they pre-recorded it to make sure that I wouldn't add a phrase that wasn't, you know, that went off the limits. The first time, I thought it's kind of ridiculous, but so did the staff. The staff's mostly laughing, the engineers and so on. But I did read it, and the first reading took 2 minutes and 36 seconds. So they told me, no, I got to reread it. So I read it a little faster, got it into 2 minutes and 30 seconds, and then they actually did run it. And there are other things like that. I'll just mention one other case. Same National Public Radio again, the kind of left medium. They have a book review thing. And again, they're under a lot of pressure often to have something about books of mine. Around 10 years ago, there was a book of mine that was based on lectures over CBC. And it was actually a bestseller in Canada for years, but you know, nobody ever heard of it in the United States. It was never reviewed or anything. But there was pressure around Boston to get them to review that book, okay? So they finally agreed. And we again had a pre-recorded 5-minute interview with Robert Siegel, who's their big shot intellectual. And it was actually announced. Their main program, it's called All Things Considered, starts at 5 o'clock, and then you know every educated person is supposed to listen to it. And at 5 o'clock, they announced that they were going to have a review of this book. The publishers, South End Press, called me up and said, "Oh, great, it's going to be on." It got to 5:30. It got to 5:25. At 5:25. The program stopped, and there were 5 minutes of music. You know, at 5:30, when they move into the next segment, they announced the next segment, and phone calls started coming in from all over the place, saying, you know, what happened to that 5-minute review? And people, I wasn't listening, but people started calling me and saying, you know, what happened to the review? So after about 10 minutes, I got a call from the manager of the whole thing in Washington, who said, you know, something very strange. We're getting a lot of calls saying that your review didn't appear, but we know that it did. I see it right on my program here. So I said, I don't know anything about it. About 10 minutes later, she called me back, very chagrined, and she said that she was overruled for the first time ever by some higher-up who heard the announcement in the first 5 minutes and canceled it. Well, that caused quite a furor. She was very upset, for professional reasons. Didn't want to be overruled. And there was a lot of public reaction. So they finally agreed to redo another 5 minutes, pre-recorded, and that was the second one they actually ran. Well, that's off at the left liberal end of the spectrum. When you move to the more conservative commercial media, they're less constrained.
There are some extremely violent right-wing groups that, for whom he is absolute anathema. I mean, they're virtually the devil incarnate, and these are groups that in the past have not hesitated to use violence or even assassination to make their case. Most of the strongest hostility at the moment seems to be coming from Zionist groups, as far as we could observe. There was a Cambodian group that put up posters denouncing him for what they claimed was denying that there was ever a massacre in Cambodia in the 1970s, which in fact he never has done, though he's disputed details of the official story that came out at that time. That, I think, is, so far as I can see, that's not doesn't seem to be a terribly dangerous group, but I thought some of the Zionist groups might be.
Every charismatic leader seems to have ultimately been found to have feet, or at least 1 foot of clay. It's something that's hard to live up to. If you're lucky, you'll die before all the books are written. But if you're not, you'll have to put up with a lot. And certainly, a lot of people are afraid to get into public life because they will be attacked personally at every level, as Chomsky has been. But I think if the American right saw him to be that leader, his life might well be in danger. Certainly lives have been lost under suspicious circumstances. And I'd be willing to go as far as to say that as long as he's talking, he's being effective. But if he puts himself in a position where they see him as a danger, then he may in fact be in some kind of physical danger. I honestly believe that.
He is an extremely controversial figure, and his his message about American foreign policy is completely uncompromising, so I think he expects the hostility. He doesn't expect everyone to just accept this and think that it's an obvious truth. I mean, there's a huge propaganda industry seeking to ignore it or to put a different point of view out.
Guys who are now in office, recycled Reaganites mostly, they understand that very well. That's the way they kept the country under control in the 80s, by one or another. The Libyans are coming, the Sandinistas are coming, on, and it frightened people. And people are genuinely frightened. So when George Bush says if we don't stop him today, he's going to come after us tomorrow with weapons of mass destruction, it scares people. I mean, very honest, serious people stand up at meetings and very heartfelt comments saying, yeah, I'm anti-war and I don't like this, but he's going to come after us and there'll be a mushroom cloud. And in fact, if you look around the world, you'll notice that the only people afraid of Saddam Hussein are people from the United States. People in the region aren't afraid of him. Europeans aren't afraid of him. I don't know about Canada. I don't follow that closely. But in the United States, there's real fear. And that's the way you control people. If you want to divert the attention of the population from an assault that you're carrying out against them, frighten them. I mean, it's an old story. And it's used by, I mean, it's second nature to everybody. And yes, in fact, they're these are guys who are mostly from the Reagan administration, and they did exactly the same thing then. So 20 years ago, they came in, Reagan administration did it. They're following the same script. first drive the country into a deep deficit from a budget surplus, the government from surplus to deficit. That means you have to you have to cut back social spending, which is very important. It was done by actually it's described in the Wall Street Journal front page this morning. I mean, they don't put it quite in the terms that I'm going to use, but they basically describe it. They point out that the Bush administration, of course, drove the country into a big deficit by things are happening independently, but their own decisions were two. One was a tax cut, which in fact is for the rich. The Wall Street Journal don't say that. So 40% of it is top 1% of the population. So a big tax cut for the rich, and the biggest increase in the in federal government spending for 20 years. That is since the Reagan administration, because these guys are believers in big government. They're not conservatives. They're reactionary, statist extremists. They want a very big government, but for the rich. So the biggest federal spending in 20 years, and a big tax cut for the rich. So of course you get a deficit, and then you can cap, social spending, and you can move on to eliminating the public education system and the limited medical support system that exists in the United States. You've got to get rid of that, cut back pensions and so on. But you don't want people to think about this. What you want is for them to be terrified. So 20 years ago, in fact, just 20 years ago, another bold cowboy was in the White House, surrounded by tanks, because there were hitmen, Libyan hitmen, roaming the streets of Washington. Were going to assassinate our leader. And everybody was trembling in fear and admiring the courage of the John Wayne up there. And it went on like that right through the 1980s. The Sandinistas were 2 days' march from Texas, and Gaddafi was going to expel us from the world, and Hispanic narco-traffickers are going to destroy our youth, and so on and so forth. And the population was terrified, and you could carry out the assault. So they're doing the same thing. Same script. So that's where Iraq comes in. Yeah, and you got to have another monster who's going to. In fact, you read George Bush. If we don't get to him now, he's going to be dropping nuclear bombs on us tomorrow. Not like a year from now, but tomorrow. It's going to attack us right away, and people are afraid. I give talks to. I haven't seen an audience of less than a couple of thousand people for quite a while, but when people ask questions, some of them are. It's very genuine. They're genuinely afraid. They say, look, if we don't stop him now, he's going to come after us. And if it isn't him, it's going to be Noriega or, some other monster Gaddafi or whoever comes along. Next, it's going to be Iran. If we don't stop him now, they're going to come after us. And that's the way you frighten people.
I want to ask you about the mobilization of fear, and you've talked a lot about it as mobilization of fear of those from without. But one of the things that I guess I would ask you is the way in which mobilization of fear from within can be actually damaging to organizing in terms of fear of one's neighbor, fear of the people who live in your community, and there's ways in which Canada too has been caught in that mobilization, and so it's not just fear of being invaded by Saddam Hussein, which in some ways is easier to address than it is to be immobilized by fear that the person you knew is somehow, and it strikes me that that's an element of fear that I'd be interested in you commenting on and what impact that's had in America, because I think that's something which at least I'm very conscious of in reading the news on an ongoing basis, and it strikes me as very much a parallel.
Fear of your actual neighbor, or fear of the guy down in the slums downtown?
No, but also the sense that it's the people who came in through Canada and they're living in our community as normal.
So anti-immigrant fear and that sort
of thing. Exactly, and therefore, in some ways, very similar to what happened in the 1950s. So the 1950s ended up being not in fact a time of great organizing, but in fact a time of enormous repression, because everybody ended up turning on one another out of fear of one another.
No, I see. I don't think there was that much repression in the 50s. I think it was internalized. I mean, if the actual repression associated with, say, McCarthyism, it was not very much. I mean, the people who didn't want to submit to it, I remember very well, just laughed at it. I mean, in fact, at the time of the Army McCarthy hearings, I was a grad student at Harvard, and you know, living at home. So they had one television set on campus for out-of-campus students, and a couple of friends of mine and I would go over in the afternoon and watch the hearings, and we were all cheering for McCarthy. For good reasons. He was being shafted because, although he was a gangster, he ran up against bigger gangsters who were going to destroy him, namely the Army. He was fine as long as he was attacking weak people, but as soon as he went after the Army, he just got crushed. You know, so we were cheering for Joe, and nothing happened to you. You know, you could do whatever you wanted. There was almost no repression. It was powerful because people accepted it. In the 1960s, they tried to redo it, and people just laughed at them, and it collapsed. You know, the House Un-American Activities Committee was still around, and you know, they got people to come and testify, and they just laughed at them, and so it disappeared because they didn't have any force behind them. So yes, there's a lot. That's internal repression, when you accept repression when it barely exists, instead of standing up against it, in which case it can collapse. But fear of the person down the road or something, that's common. So take, say, the neighborhood where I live in near Boston. It's a kind of a professional, you know, upper middle class suburb with a lot of, you know, professors and doctors and that kind of thing. When you, at night, you know, every couple of nights, 3 o'clock in the morning, some horrible alarm goes off, waking up everybody in the neighborhood. Turns out everybody's got an alarm except us. Everyone has an alarm system, and they go off randomly, and they're all linked to the police station, which doesn't ever answer them because they assume they're false alarms.